come on down.
Okay.
All right. Roger, thank you. Eric, thank you for those introductions. This is really, I feel honored to be back at Hagley talking about this. I think that's better. Both Eric and Roger, is this mic working? Yes, it is. Both Eric and Roger commented on earlier papers that I gave, including one at the Hagley Research Series on this, and so I'm especially excited to share with you where this has come. And also, thank you all for coming out tonight to hear about the project. There are a lot of books about war, and there are a lot of books about music, but there aren't a lot of books about music and war together, and that's sort of what I attempted to do with this project that I want to tell you about. The thing that I thought I would start with, I thought I'd start with a fact that I came across in the course of doing my research. And that is, this is a small detail, but it really just leapt out at me. And that is that in 2015, the US Congress allocated some $437 million for music in the military. That was an amount 3 times the size of the entire budget of the National Endowment for the Arts. And just let that sink in for a second. The US Congress put more, 3 times as much money into military music as it put into all other support for the arts combined. Now, admittedly, $437 million was a drop in the bucket of the overall defense budget that year, but it was a figure that helped me put in perspective the state's commitment to music and sort of think about what this might mean. And I also learned around this time that I was working on this that the military was the world's largest employer of musicians. I was sort of thinking about this, and this raised a lot of questions for me about the significance of music in effect, unexpected places. So the book that grew out of these questions is an attempt to understand the relationship between music and war, about what music has meant for the military, and about what music has meant for soldiers, and how music has contributed, in fact, to preparing and sustaining America's fighters for more than 150 years. Now, one of the first arguments that I make in the book is that one way to think about the military is that it is, among other things, a musical institution. This isn't how most people think of the military, as a musical institution. But I make a case that there is, in fact, ample evidence that music is present in virtually all aspects of military life, what I call the life cycle of soldiering, recruitment, basic training, active duty deployment, transitioning back to civilian life. Music has been part of all of these. Let me just show you these, just to give you some visual examples. As a bugler from the Civil War. These are some World War II soldiers. They are gathered around a piano, and right here, this is a guy with a guitar. This is a photograph from a hospital in World War I, an Iraq War soldier with an iPod, and some Vietnam soldiers with the phonograph there. So rousing recruitment anthems have urged civilians to enlist. Buglers blowing Reveille have stirred soldiers from their slumber, and trainees have chanted in boot camp like this. Now, beyond that, active duty soldiers have made and listened to music themselves wherever and however they could, whether this meant singing or listening to phonographs or radios or iPods, whether it meant going to USO shows, and music in hospitals and music therapy have aided soldiers when wounded, and taps has long marked the end of military funerals. In other words, a lot of music here. Occasionally, there has even been music woven into the actual fighting of war. In 1863, there were at least 10 bands that were present at the Battle of Gettysburg. And one of those bands, at least one of those bands, played when the fighting was at its apex. And when I encountered this fact, I thought, surely that must be fanciful, right? That just seems too much. There was, in fact, a British officer who was a guest of Robert E. Lee's army, and he wrote in his diary after the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, when the cannonade was at its height, a Confederate band began to play polkas and waltzes, which sounded very curious, accompanied by the hissing and bursting of the shells. So this, unexpected places here. In some ways, it's hard to wrap your head around how much music has coursed through the military. To get a sense of the scale. This photograph gives you some idea of the scale of some of the military music in World War II. This shows 35 tons of band music collected for the U.S. Naval School of Music in World War II. Tons is not usually the unit of measurement that we have for sheet music. Now, paying attention to all this music, we come to realize that the sounds, that all these sounds were not just accompaniment to, but they were actually part of how the military worked. Music helped the military operate smoothly and efficiently, and it helped soldiers cope with the strains of soldiering, the physical, psychological, and emotional strains of military service, from the arduous, sometimes traumatic experiences of combat to the feelings of excruciating homesickness and boredom, the full range, all part of soldiers' experiences. Music, you might say, functioned as a lubricant in the American war machine. It has been a kind of war material, integral to the military's operational capacities. As a Union officer wrote in 1862, "It would be a dreary service indeed without music, and I don't believe the men could be kept together without it." A World War I pilot in Europe wrote home to his father, "If you want to help win the war, send me some phonograph records." Last year, a veteran from Afghanistan recalled, "I have literally returned fire with Carly Rae Jepsen's Call Me Maybe on." And to remind you of what this battle-hardened war song sounds like, here's a short clip. Now, of course, in some ways, the musicality of the military is already well known. It should be quite familiar to, I would guess, all or nearly all of us in some ways. Music has been part of waging war since time immemorial, really. Music and war have been connected in the oldest history books, Thucydides, Herodotus. It's pictured in the tombs, in ancient tombs. There are pictures of soldiers and musicians together. And even people who have never served in the military are familiar with buglers blowing Reveille and the chanting of sound off in basic training and so on. But despite this familiarity, it's actually rare to find any kind of historical treatment of this practice or critical thinking or analytical thinking about what this music has meant for war making. And with this in mind, there are three things that my book does that I want to highlight that are entirely new. The first one is that the book approaches music in an unusual way. Scholars who've written about music in war, in the context of war, have often focused on song lyrics. But I approach music more broadly, more holistically. I am interested in song lyrics, but I'm also interested in the whole process of musical activity. I approach music not just as notes or lyrics, but rather as something that people do. And this allows me to connect a wide range of musical practices and to show how they are connected, how singing and listening are both part of music, what people do. And this spans from singing in the Civil War to spinning phonograph records in World War I or World War II to blasting heavy metal from Humvees in Iraq, from an iPod. In Iraq, there were, before the Battle of Fallujah, there were these huge loudspeakers mounted on the top of Humvees where normally you'd have machine guns, and they blasted heavy metal and hard rock at the Iraqis before the Battle of Fallujah. Second thing my book does, although music has been part of waging war the world over for millennia, I contend in my book that there is a unique history of music in American war making since the 1860s. Other countries have had music in their militaries, but no other country has had the industrial, commercial, and technological infrastructure comparable to what the United States has had to support music in the military. And the juggernaut of the American culture industry, the juggernaut of the American media companies, has been a distinct factor in supplying and cultivating music in the military. So, for example, in World War II, the War Department created the world's first global radio network, the Armed Forces Radio Network, and it did so in a very short period of time, in only a couple of years. And it did so by working very closely with experienced personnel from the radio industry, from the private sector. Moreover, many of the soldiers who listened to Armed Forces Radio listened on special custom radio sets that were designed and manufactured for the military for soldiers. So no other country had the technology, the resources, and the manufacturing capabilities that the United States could bring to bear on music in war. The third thing that my book does is that I take pains to show that music was not only present in the military, but it was also critical to how the military functioned. It was not an afterthought. It wasn't ancillary. It wasn't part of how, it was part of how the military worked. In the Civil War, military regiments went to the front with brass bands accompanying them. In World War II, there were pianos that were installed in the hulls of naval ships before they left the shipyard. So what this means is that the pianos weren't brought aboard later. There wasn't like an afterthought. They were part of these building the ships from the start. In Iraq, soldiers shipped out with iPods in their essential equipment. It was expected that these devices would be part of what helped soldiers perform their duties and survive their tours. So let me say a couple of general things about the book. So the book is organized chronologically. Begins with the Civil War, and then it proceeds through the Spanish-American War and the Philippines, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Over 7 chapters, I show that all this musical activity was critical and crucial to making and maintaining American soldiers. And it was so because it functioned in two complementary, or it functioned in two ways that complemented each other. On the one hand, music functioned in this as a top-down tool of the institution, of the military. Music was a tool that the military used to train, condition, and discipline soldiers. So if you think about the chanting of sound off in basic training and boot camp, this singing is literally part of the process by which the military mass-produced warriors, transforming civilians into soldiers. On the other hand, or in a complementary way, music was also a bottom-up tool of the rank and file at soldiers' disposal to help them cope with the strains of soldiering, enabling them to perform what was, in fact, arduous emotional labor, the emotional labor of soldiering, which was part and parcel of being a soldier. So this emotional labor spanned from putting one's own life at risk to coping with friends being wounded or killed in combat, all the way from there to the grueling experience of homesickness and boredom that is also part and parcel of soldiers' experience. Always, almost always. One of the books that I drew on in the course of this research was actually an entire book on the subject of enduring military boredom, when I realized that there was a whole book on this, I was like, oh, this is a substantial phenomenon. Now, top-down and bottom-up musical activity worked in concert. They were dialectically. It was an integral part of attracting civilian recruits, transforming those people into warriors, and then keeping them going as active duty soldiers. Now, at the same time, music was a valuable collective resource for addressing soldiers' social and psychological needs. It was a practice that bonded soldiers to one another, and just as importantly, it helped them preserve their own individual psychological and emotional identities. Now, about halfway through working on this project, I was talking to a colleague about it, and he said, okay, fine, it's very interesting, but why music? What is it about music that has this power, that makes this possible? And at the time, I confess, I had only a really half-baked answer for him, but I realized this was a crucial question. And as I thought about it later, I realized that what I was interested in, essentially, was people, not music per se. And this reminded me of a line that I had read by a French scholar named Didier Francfort, who was a scholar of music and violence. And he has this line, he says that he doesn't consider himself a historian of music, he considers himself a historian with music. And I like that. That really resonated with me because the goal of this project was to understand something about war making, essentially, not simply to recover or appreciate something about music per se, for its own sake. And that's why this is a book that is primarily concerned with musical activity. Music as something that people do. Focusing on song lyrics tells you, in fact, very little about what music meant in soldiers' lives or what soldiers did with music. I was interested in how soldiers in the Civil War came to remember dozens of different drum and bugle calls to tell them where they should be and what they should be doing at different times. I was interested in how soldiers got into fistfights in Vietnam over what music was on the jukebox. I was interested in how soldiers in Iraq assaulted local populations with hard rock and heavy metal, as I've mentioned already. This focus on musical activity foregrounds music as a relationship. This was part of the conceptual move that I made in this book. It conceptualizes music as a connection that exists between different kinds of people in different kinds of conditions, with different kinds of consequences. Music, you could say, is a social and cultural practice that depends on the intersection of composers, performers, and listeners. All of them are essential for the practice of music. But so are other people, like musical instrument manufacturers, music publishers and printers, and in this case, military officials who either organized or tolerated or encouraged soldiers to have music. Music in this sense is more of a process than it is a product. And its meaning rests not in the sounds necessarily, but in the interrelatedness of the sounds and human agency or human practice. Now, to put this differently, this focus on music as an activity allowed me to think about music, quote unquote, in action, which is to say, as situated social practice, grounded in particular times and particular places with particular effects. So not in the abstract, but in what was music doing in specific places in specific times. And you could even say that approaching music this way enables us to think about musical activity in terms of making stuff possible, what it makes possible. There's a sociologist who's written about music in this way, and she says that she approaches music, in her words, as a resource for getting things done. So this is a different way of approaching music, and this is what I attempted to do in the book. But I'm still wondering, why is it that music has this power? And the answer requires that we recognize the complexity of soldiers' identities. This is, as I got deeper and deeper into this, I realized this was really important, that at different moments, soldiers had different identities. Sometimes they were warriors. Sometimes they were patriotic citizens. Sometimes, at certain moments, they were sons or boyfriends or consumers or horny post-adolescents or whatever, like all these different identities that soldiers enacted. And what was special about music was that it could harmonize these different identities so that they reinforced one another rather than being in tension. In a single moment, music could affect soldiers individually, bond them to one another, and connect them to the institution that they were all bound to serve. At the same time, musical activity existed in relation to other sounds. Roger mentioned my interest in sound as a phenomenon unto itself. I realized that when you're talking about music, there's also lots of other sounds around, especially in theaters of war. So this music existed in relation to the cacophony of combat, to the cries of the wounded and dying, the silences before and after battle. And in response to these sounds, musical activity functioned as a means by which soldiers could exert control over their environment. They could use music to exert control over their environment under these circumstances. It was a tool that they could use to displace, even for a few minutes, the soundscape that was governed by the military or governed by the violence that they were immersed in. So on the one hand, music made possible a certain kind of escape. There was a veteran from World War II who recalled how when he listened to Count Basie and Duke Ellington in World War II, it affected him really profoundly. He said, "You are excuse me. He said, "You are not in the army. You are not at home. In fact, you are not anywhere, just out in the world of memories." That's what music did for him. On the other hand, musical activity could also be a way for soldiers to redeem where they were, the place where they were. So through music, the far away, what was at home, could feel near, and the near could feel far away. Now, of course, this form of control was limited and ephemeral, but it was also meaningful, deeply meaningful, and it helped keep soldiers going from one day to the next. Now, part of what made music uniquely suited to do this was its malleable nature. Music is unique in its reach, its versatility, its mutability, its capacity to be deployed just about anywhere, anytime. its ability to move people deeply in mind and body. Music does all these things. But more than that, musical activity has been so valuable, so pervasive, so integral to waging war because, both from the top and from below, because it allowed soldiers to feel. It helped them feel. It helped them articulate the web of relationships in which they were entangled. And only music could do this because many of those relationships were of such subtlety and complexity that it would have been difficult or impossible to explain them in words. What words could adequately express a soldier's fear of killing a stranger or of never seeing a loved one again? What language could do justice to a warrior's grief or resentment of the military? Music could do this. What other means could voice not only the simultaneity of these and other feelings, but also the delicate and intricate ways that they were interconnected? Music was a means of both formulating and balancing these feelings. Now, as a historical source, working on this was challenging at times because sound is ephemeral and elusive compared to textual sources. And to give readers an idea of the sounds that I write about, I created an audio-visual companion for the book that is on my website. And there I have made available a whole bunch of audio recordings and video recordings that are discussed in the book. So if you're reading about the Civil War and you're wondering what did these drum and bugle calls sound like, there are videos like this one from the National Park Service. Let's see if this is going to work.
That people call sick call would tell the soldiers that were not feeling too well to go and see the camp surgeon. These camp calls.
So I get a sense of what these sounds were actually like. Let's go back here. Okay. The website also features a bunch of Spotify playlists of songs that were popular among soldiers, often a lot of surprises in there, not songs necessarily that you'd expect in many cases. There are also archival recordings that I collected, like there's a recording of a tape made by a CIA liaison officer in Saigon. He recorded parties at his home in Saigon in the 1960s. And I was able to get a hold of this tape, and it's available on the website. So over the 7 chapters in this book, I cover a great deal of ground. Maybe I've already sort of suggested that. I explore African-American bands in the Civil War. I analyze, this was a fascinating thing I came across, a satirical song about waterboarding from the Philippines, written by an American soldier. I explore the popularity of country music in Vietnam, and I discuss the weaponization of music in Iraq and its use in torturing detainees, covering a lot of ground. And to pull all of this together, for you, I want to highlight what I think are three findings. The first one, I guess I've already alluded to, and that is that the US military was saturated with music. Again, a few pictures here. Top left. This was a guy named Robert Henry Hendershot. He claimed to have been the youngest person to enlist in the Union Army in the Civil War at the age of 11. He's probably about 14 when this picture was taken. This was probably not true. In fact, there were probably younger drummer boys than him, age 9 and 10, who served in the Union Army, but he got a reputation as the youngest. He claimed that title. This one here, in World War I, the U.S. Army issued songbooks to its soldiers. This is the cover of the songbook issued to soldiers, to doughboys, as they were called in World War I. Here's a guitar-slinging songster in Vietnam in, I think, 1966. This here is the 1st Colorado Regimental Band in Manila in 1900, around 1900. And this is an interesting one. I love this one. This is an illustrated envelope. There was a soldier named Sergeant Gerald Duquette, wrote a letter home to his wife, 1944, and his friend, not even him, but his friend, a guy named Samuel Boylston, who was like a hobbyist cartoonist, illustrated the envelope. And here you can see a bunch of soldiers. They're kind of in their cups, and their musical notes here. They're getting drunk and they're singing together. So you get a sense of the deep way that music was woven into their lives. Okay, saturation. In World War II, for example, not only were pianos installed in the hulls of naval ships, the military also airlifted specially designed olive green Steinways that were called Victory pianos to soldiers stationed on the ground around the world. Millions of soldiers saw USO performances and listened to phonographs and radios that were issued by the military. And through the military postal service, soldiers received a monthly circular called the Army Hit Kit. Army Hit Kit. They received this every month, which had the lyrics in it of the latest popular songs that their loved ones were enjoying back home. Their friends and loved ones were enjoying back home. You can see here it says March 1944, contents. These are the songs in here. And then it says below, issued monthly by Special Services Division, U.S. Army. We could talk a lot about this. If we can come back to it if you want. It's quite remarkable, but this particular cover. But anyway, yes. Okay, so saturation. Then the second the thing that I found that I thought I should underscore was that with all this saturation, there was a lot of things that surprised me. It wasn't always what I expected that I came across in the archives. For example, I was surprised to learn that in World War I, soldiers regularly participated in large-scale singing events called mass sings in basic training. Led by volunteer song leaders, thousands of soldiers would join together in song in daily or weekly singing sessions. So I'll show you what a couple of these look like. These are a bunch of Marines. This is the song leader here with his arms outstretched. Bunch of sailors there in Michigan. Here's obviously this is the song leader getting them all riled up. And you can see they're holding song sheets or songbooks. And then there was this one, bunch of Army soldiers from Camp McClellan in Alabama. This gives you some sense of the scale that some of these singing events had. Quite amazing. General J. Franklin Bell, who was the commanding officer of the 18,000-man Camp Upton on Long Island, and who was also the former chief of staff of the U.S. Army, said, "A songless army would lack in fighting spirit in proportion as it lacked responsiveness to music. There is no more potent force for developing unity in an army than song." He was not unique. Another World War I general, Leonard Wood, who had earlier been one of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, he'd been a hero of the Indian Wars, and a former military governor of Cuba and the Philippines. In other words, he was hardcore. He put it this way: "It sounds odd to the ordinary person when you tell him every soldier should be a singer, because the layman cannot reconcile singing with killing. but it is just as essential that the soldiers should know how to sing as that they should carry rifles and learn how to shoot them. These military officials, in other words, considered music a martial necessity in World War I. In their minds, music was linked to efficiency, standardization, and Americanization, which were some of the key concepts of the World War I era. I also found this picture in the War Department records of at the National Archives. This picture, the official caption of this one was, "Music and guns go hand in hand on the Western Front in France." Dated July 1918, it shows a convivial group of soldiers, some British, some American. Some are holding firearms, some are holding musical instruments, some are empty-handed. And according to the caption went on, they were preparing for a musical evening in their camp. Now, the silent image here obviously gives us no idea about the actual music that they were going to enjoy, but it does suggest, this picture, I think, the close and casual association between music and soldierly camaraderie. The existence of this image and the caption also reflect the War Department's conscious recognition of the power of music in the lives of active duty soldiers. So thinking about what it meant that this photograph existed. This photograph was actually made by the government's propaganda agency during World War I, the Committee for Public Information, which may have distributed it to the press. So in this respect, we see a couple of things going on here. One is it's an artifact of the war. It reflects the music in soldiers' lives, but it's also a reflection of the government's interest in documenting and publicizing this musical behavior. So thinking about what this did, how it circulated. In the Library of Congress, I found a vibrantly colored propaganda poster, a triptych here. In the middle, you see a soldier, rifle in one hand, hurling a grenade with the other. But on the left, a bugler. And on the right, soldiers gathered around a piano. And at the top, the slogans, "Music makes for morale," and "A singing army is a fighting army." So in these images that I'm showing you here, music and the violence of war were intimately connected, both in soldiers' daily lives and in the public-facing effort to mobilize people and resources on the home front. These efforts had deep implications for the work that music did in what was then the bloodiest, most destructive war that the world had yet seen. Okay. Then, I got to Vietnam. And in fact, I was really struck even more, I was surprised even more by what I encountered when I started to look into Vietnam. This chapter in the book was almost titled, "Everything You Know About Music in the Vietnam War is Wrong." I decided not to, in the end, call it that, but that was the working title. And it was so because more than any other war, Vietnam comes with a built-in soundtrack. You know, The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, etc. But what I found was that this ready-made soundtrack is largely a Hollywood fantasy. It distorts what music in the lives of American soldiers was really like in Southeast Asia, and more importantly, it distorts what music did in the Vietnam War. Take radio, for example, of which there was a lot. In 1968, the Armed Forces Radio conducted a survey of its listeners, and it found that 80% of U.S. soldiers listened to 2 or more hours of Armed Forces Radio per day, okay? And what they were listening to when they were listening to all this radio was top 40 pop and oldies, not the Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, and so on, or what today we would call classic rock. Now, of course, there was some rock mixed into the top 40 at that time, but rock was not its signature sound. I'll give you a suggestion of this. The Billboard Top 100 from 1970, just so you know that I'm not making this up. The red square at the top, red rectangle at the top is the top 5. Top 5 songs from 1970. One is a rock song, American Woman by the Canadian band The Guess Who. Then 3 other much softer songs. You get Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel. You get Close to You by the Carpenters, and Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. This was the top 5. And then the 5th one was Edwin Starr's War, What Is It Good For? Absolutely Nothing, which Armed Forces Radio did not play. So this gives you some idea of what was going through, what soldiers were actually listening to on a daily basis. Now, country music also made up a big part of the musical soundscape in Vietnam. There were country music shows on the radio. There were country music singles in the jukeboxes in the enlisted men's clubs. And there were country music LPs in the record bins of the post exchange stores where American GIs could go to buy American goods. And all of this country music did not sit well with the large number of African-American troops who favored R&B and soul music, which were not well represented on Armed Forces Radio in the jukeboxes or in the record bins. And this often led to violent clashes between the white country music fans and the black soul music fans. We have an idea in our heads that rock and roll was the music of rebellion. But in Vietnam, country and soul music caused a lot more problems for the military than rock ever did. This is a picture of James Brown in the summer of 1968, performing for a bunch of GIs, a bunch of very happy GIs. Now, other surprises. This was one of numerous surprises. These were numerous surprises that I found going into Vietnam. Other surprises that I found included the persistence of singing. I thought that singing, the kind of singing that soldiers were doing around the piano that I showed you from World War I, I thought that had totally faded out by the time you get to Vietnam. But when a group of Marines were interviewed by a CBS News reporter during the Tet Offensive in 1968, the reporter said, "How do you keep your spirits up?" And the Marine said, I guess we play cards and sing at night. And another notable surprise here was that I encountered was that not all the songs that they were singing were anti-war songs. We have in our head this huge, we have this sense that all soldiers were anti-war, that they were so totally disaffected. But in fact, some soldiers sang pro-war songs. In the war, especially the airmen. And some of these songs are completely shocking. Some of them glorify, for example, the dropping of napalm. Here are the lyrics of one. "Fire, fire, fire, it looks like the end, singes the hair and burns the skin. Burn, 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 people burned and marred by pretty red flames, their bodies well scarred. Isn't napalm pretty to watch? It's a gas for you and me." Now this is a far cry from the rock songs and the anti-war anthems that Hollywood and Ken Burns have drilled into our collective imagination. This is not to say that there was no rock music in Vietnam or that it wasn't important, because there was rock music in Vietnam and it was important. But if we want to understand what music meant for American soldiers and what it meant for the war, we need to recognize that the musical landscape of Vietnam bore little resemblance to what you see in movies or on TV. One more example. So the Ken Burns series, The Vietnam War, 18 hours, 10 episodes. The music is a big part of it, features over 120 songs. There's a whole website dedicated to it. And of those, 2 were country songs. And neither of those 2 was even representative of the kind of country music, the Nashville music, country music, that soldiers would have been listening to in Vietnam. So don't go to that for a sense of what soldiers were really listening to. Okay. Third thing I found concerned technology. On the one hand, music in the military was frequently on the cutting edge. Music in the military was often on the cutting edge of technology. Whether this meant supplying soldiers with phonographs in World War I, or radios in World War II, or facilitating the use of iPods in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the other hand, what I want to suggest in the book is that there's also a way of thinking about music itself functioning as a kind of military technology. If we understand technology not simply as hardware, but as the way things are made and done, which is one of the classic definitions of technology in the field, the history of technology, the way things are made and done. If we think about music this way, music was part of making war. And that's, in that sense, we can think about music as a kind of military technology. So what music did, in this sense, was more important than how it sounded. Many of the sounds changed from war to war, but the ways that music contributed to waging war remained remarkably durable. Okay, so what's at stake in all this? Why should we care? Well, ultimately, what's at stake in historicizing the military as a musical institution, I think there are 2 things. One is musical and one is military. First, the musical. Under the right circumstances, music can help us reach new heights. It can help us imagine new worlds. Whether it is linked to Apollonian majesty or Dionysian ecstasy, the subject of music, for most people, conjures up pleasures of the mind and body. The force of music can be emancipatory, either politically or libidinally. Musical activity can be a means of challenging or circumventing structures of authority and repression. Music can do all these things. It can stir us emotionally, and it can relocate us to idealized psychic spaces, what the scholar Josh Kuhn has called audiotopias. Music can move us there. Under the right circumstances, music can help us be our best selves. But to appreciate these potentialities, I think we also have to confront how the force of music can be channeled in the opposite direction, too. In numerous ways, musical activity has enabled the complex machinery of war to function, helping people to kill and destroy, an agent of negation, not just creation. So for all of the innumerable, incalculable ways that music has uplifted and inspired people, for all it has done to challenge and circumvent structures of authority and repression, it has also functioned to uphold and extend institutions of power. For all the joy and pleasure that music brings into the world every day, it has also contributed to the waging of war. Taking measure of what this has meant can help us see both music and war, I think, in a new way. Now, finally, let me say something about the military stakes here. What this has to do with the relationship between war and society. Wars don't happen simply because political leaders wish them to, decide on them. Wars happen because they require a mobilization of populations and resources. And they require that that mobilization of people and resources is sustained. Now, however simple or obvious this may sound, making and maintaining soldiers is not a self-evident process. For a nation to go to war, individuals must go to war. Individuals who, it must be stressed, would generally rather not, right? Attending to music can help us comprehend the complex processes by which such individuals were transformed into and nourished as soldiers. Attending to music can elucidate the emotional labor that made the work of waging war possible on a personal, emotional, and corporeal level. So every nation that goes to war faces certain basic challenges. How to fill the ranks of the military, how to train ordinary civilians to harm perfect strangers, how to maintain warriors, not only through the most strenuous, demanding aspects of soldiering, but also the most boring and tedious, and how to prepare those fighters for the return to civilian life when they lay their weapons down. Introducing music into this analysis of large-scale state violence can show us how tightly these issues are intertwined, how tightly they're bound. Now, to be clear, I'm not arguing that America's wars could not have been fought without music. The point is, they weren't. The point is, where there was war, there was music too. So if, as students of history, we wish to understand how wars happen, there is much to be gained, not just from looking at the past, but also opening our ears and listening to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Wow. All right. Got some questions? Got some thoughts? Let's hear them. Eric's got the microphone.
Thank you for the effort that it took to put this together. But I'm curious about a couple of things. One, the lyrics that you put up there about napalm.
Yeah.
What was common when I was flying was we had a macabre way of dealing with things. And the plane that I flew was frequently referred to as an iron coffin. That being said, I noticed in particular, with one exception, you had a photograph that actually used the word morale, but none of your presentation stressed how music provided morale or that music provided escapism from what they were going through.
I'm sorry, what was the last thing you said?
About how...
Yeah. So I think those are really valuable points, and I really appreciate you bringing them up. Morale is curious because morale is central to the whole book. There's quite a bit on the importance of morale, which is what music is really bound up with. But there's a guy who wrote about military management in World War I, and he said, morale is tough to talk to people about because nobody likes to be told we're doing this to elevate your morale. It's like digestion. You want it to work, but nobody likes to talk about it. You don't want it, it sort of seems impolite to talk about explicitly. And so there were all of these things that were done in the military to keep people's spirits up. And I'm sure you have many stories of your own ways that things that elevated you, that kept your morale up. And one of the things that music did was to keep people connected elsewhere, connected back home. It was a way, a form of escapism, a way of being somewhere else, and absenting themselves. That's what I meant when I said it was a way of exerting control over the place where people were. So I think all of those things are quite true. My sense of the lyrics is that, yes, there was a real macabre humor, but that there were also, there was a tremendous amount of support in certain parts of the military for the mission that soldiers were on, which is completely understandable. So I don't know that those are in contradiction, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk and work on this interesting aspect of music. One of the things I noted was the absence of any strings. And of course there's brass and vocals, which I can see. But I'm always aware of the soothing nature of strings. And it seems to be pretty absent in the material you presented. I don't know.
Yeah, save guitars, right, exactly. I took that. Well, strings, I mean, stringed instruments tend to be very fragile. Brass instruments are a lot more durable. They were not featured. Most of these were wind and brass bands. So they were, and that goes back to the 19th century. But there are military musicians who play stringed instruments, and the stuff that soldiers were listening to occasionally had strings. So when soldiers were listening to what were called V-discs in World War II, these were specially made records for soldiers. A lot of them had swing music on them, but some of them had strings on them as well. When you get to Iraq, soldiers had this huge catalog of music that they listened to on their iPods. Some of them listened to much more soothing music, some of which had strings. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that is crucial to understanding just the number of different things that music was doing. It helped soldiers cope with the melancholy of soldiering. And in the case of Iraq, by the time you get to soldiers having these iPods with huge catalogs on them, soldiers were making up these playlists that they could use to serve different functions. They would have a psych up playlist that they would listen to before going out on patrol. Lots of really heavy driving music, lots of heavy metal, heavy rock, hip hop. And then they would have cool down playlists that they would listen to when they came back, when their adrenaline was flowing and they knew that they needed to relax. And so they were able to kind of finely calibrate all the things that music could do. And string music plays into this, and I have some examples of that. So thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. I thought we were all going to come and sing together, and I'd hope you'd make your book vocal, that maybe you have some built-in tapes into each page so we can listen to some of the music. But I'm wondering the propaganda effects of music. If you were, say, in not the Western Front, but in Western Europe during the Second World War, if there was any effort made by, say, the Axis, the German side, of listening to a Brahms, listening to a Beethoven, and how it might affect our own military to not want to fight Germany.
Okay.
So, was music effective in doing that?
There were propaganda broadcasters who broadcast at the Allied troops in World War II. Axis Sally was one. Lord Haw Haw was another. And they would speak to the Allied troops, and they would try to undermine their morale, and they would occasionally play generally more popular music. They tried to be entertaining DJs, or today we would call them DJs, hosts, on the radio. And by the time you get to Vietnam, there is, what's her name? Hanoi Hannah, is that her name? I think it's Hanoi Hannah. Yeah? Am I remembering that correctly? Anyway, there is a Vietnam-era analog to the World War II propaganda broadcasters who broadcast from North Vietnam. to the American troops, and she would speak to them directly about the conditions that they were in, trying to undermine morale, and would play pop music that American soldiers couldn't hear on armed forces radio. Sometimes it was really ironic stuff. Sometimes it was tracks that they couldn't hear because they were too rock or whatever. But from what I understand, the records that I found, they were not widely listened to. This is in Vietnam. They were not widely listened to by the American GIs. That they occasionally listened, but that wasn't a big factor in undermining. It wasn't very successful at undermining American morale. And I believe that was generally true in World War II. The Americans were concerned about these enemy broadcasters, but they didn't do too much. They weren't really effective in reversing Americans' loyalties. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I watched the Ken Burns series.
Yeah.
But what I remember in Vietnam, having spent a year there, was a lot of the music was personal in terms of micro cassettes, tape decks. I was in a pretty unique situation, but I don't remember much on Armed Forces radio. I don't remember a lot of rock, but I remember the folk music, kind of the anti-war folk music was very prominent in the late 60s into the early 70s. And the Beatles, Neil Diamond, Simon and Garfunkel, those people. But I'd like you to comment, one, on the folk music of that time. And the only other thing I'd comment on, in the first half of November of 1970, I was in Japan on my way back to Konus. You couldn't walk down the street or turn around the corner and not hear raindrops keep falling on my head.
Thank you for the reminiscence and for the question. So a couple thoughts. Folk music. There was a lot of anti-war folk music, guitar slinging soldiers. There was also pro-war folk sing. There was a folk tradition that was sort of like more Kingston Trio than Bob Dylan. And some of these songs are captured in the tapes made by the CIA liaison officer at his home that are available on my website that I mentioned in the talk. And so some of them, so there's this range of folk music. And the folk music revival of the post-war period empowered lots of people to become musicians. And some of those people either brought guitars with them or they acquired them through the PX stores, or they acquired them off base. And I think that was part of it too. You mentioned the tapes that people had. And one of the things that was interesting, and I don't know if you remember this, but from what I understand from my research is that American GIs in Vietnam could often buy electronics, say at the PX store, that were available to them before they were available in the US, like cassette tapes. The cassette tapes became more common because they were so easy to use, opposed to having reel-to-reel tapes, which American soldiers did also. I may have a photo on there somewhere. So there was tape trading that was an alternative to listening to Armed Forces radio. But there were these different pockets within the military, different cultures within the military, and some were big into tape trading, and some were listening to a lot of Armed Forces radio, and some were doing both. When I came across this survey of listeners to Armed Forces radio, I thought this is very interesting, but maybe this is not. Maybe I should be skeptical. Maybe I should be, reading this critically. There may be selection bias. There may be, who answered this? What was the response rate? All this stuff was spelled out in the report, and then I found an article in Rolling Stone magazine, the bastion of the counterculture, that was a report on music among GIs based on a survey that Rolling Stone had conducted of GIs, and it basically affirmed the same thing, that there were some hardcore rock fans, and there were some hardcore country, and there were a lot of hardcore country fans. There were a lot of people in the middle, a lot of people who had very middle of the road tastes, as should be, is normal. So these were some of the things that I found in my research. So thank you. Yeah.
Is it true that a new Army general gets assigned a band?
That a new Army general gets assigned a band? A new. I'm not sure about that. I'm not even gonna hazard a guess. That seems quite reasonable. I mean, I know that in certain circumstances, generals have had bands attached to them. That was quite common in earlier search. I know in the 19th century, in the Philippines and Spanish-American War, then it was very common. I'm not sure about today. So it's a good question. Let me look into it. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Quick question. Did you discuss the Korean conflict or the Korean War in the book at all?
I've gotten that question before. It's a really good question. I don't discuss Korea all that much. And the reason for this is that it was less distinctive as a war. Like what happens in World War II is very clearly of that moment. Vietnam is pretty different. The Korean conflict is sort of like the World War II light in terms of the musical activity. There was still the hit kit, but it wasn't as important and that kind of thing. So less on Korea. There's a little bit in the book on it, but not so much. Yeah, it's a good question. Fair question, yeah. Yes?
Hi, back here in the back. Two things. One, in the Army, we called the chants cadences.
Yes.
And, when I was in music classes, we, studied them as cadences. So, yeah.
Or Jody calls, right?
Mm-hmm. So my question is, in your presentation, every quote, all the evidences, everything that you portrayed was of male soldiers. You did mention a female DJ, but I was wondering in your book, what do you have regarding things from the female soldiers?
Thanks for the question. And the point about the cadences, they're also called Jody calls because there's a recurring figure in a lot of the cadences named Jody. It's another story. But women in the military, there is a whole section on the women in the military in World War II, the WACs, the waves, and the ways that their musical culture both paralleled and departed from the male GIs in World War II. There is a little bit in World War I, not so much. There were women who were involved in the military in World War I, but there's not too much on them. And then there's more on women in the Iraq and Afghanistan, more recent conflicts. I have some examples there. There is also, in Vietnam too, there's a story of there was a certain kind of band that was in Vietnam that was made up of soldiers when the military would send these bands to places that were too dangerous to send like civilian professional musicians to play in. They would go to forward operating bases that were very dangerous, and then to entertain the soldiers there, to keep their morale up, the military would send these bands there made up of soldiers who would audition for them. And these could be very dangerous. And one of the stories that I tell in the book is of one of these bands that was fronted by this woman. She'd been I think she'd been a stenographer or something in Saigon, and she'd auditioned for this band and goes on to tell this story that's quite harrowing in two respects. One of them is that all of her band ends up getting killed except for her. That's the second one. The first one is she talks about the sexual violence against women, female soldiers, and nurses and women who are attached to the military in various ways in Vietnam. And she has this example where she says, it's quite chilling. She says, I didn't care. There were these GIs who were like listening to her band and getting all excited, and she says, I didn't care what they did to me, I didn't care what they said, I didn't care if they poured beer all over me, as long as they didn't rape me. And there's a whole book that I can steer you to about sexual assault in the military, perhaps you know it. So there's that sort of back channel that sort of haunts this participation. But so those are, women are popping up in the book sporadically. Long-winded answer.
Did you cover any of the USO tours overseas, such as Bob Hope, Marilyn Monroe, Anne Margaret, maybe Jane Fonda at one point, or whomsoever?
Yeah, I'm sorry, what about those tours?
Had you covered anything in your book about any of the USO tours?
Yeah. So the USO was an organization that sort of did two things. They had these tours, and they brought professional musicians from the States to soldiers who were deployed all over. There were famous ones like your Bob Hopes, and they would also bring all kinds of B and C list artists too, because the main thing was to entertain the troops. And they would bring B list and C list because there were so many troops. There were 16 million soldiers, U.S. soldiers in World War II. And so they would bring in all these entertainers to entertain them. And sometimes, generally, they were playing to a captive audience. And so mostly soldiers were like into it because the alternatives were like nothing. But also sometimes they could be tough audiences too. So it's in there. And then I also discussed the other functions of the USO too, but I'll leave that for another time.